Friends, it is such an honor to welcome our last panel, another extraordinary group of scholars of diverse perspectives, and I'm so excited for our conversations. Let me introduce them and we'll jump right in. Nadine Strossen is John Marshall Harlan Professor of Law Emerita at New York Law School, Senior Fellow with FIRE. Her most recent books are Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, and Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. Jonathan Turley, my great GW colleague, is J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Professor of Public Interest Law, Director of the Environmental Law Advocacy Center, and Executive Director of the Project for Older Prisoners at George Washington University Law School. His new wonderful book is The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. And Kenji Yoshino is Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at New York University School of Law. He's the director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. He currently serves on the Oversight Board for Meta, and his most recent book is Say the Right Thing, How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Jonathan, congratulations on the success of your new book, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. You eloquently argue that free speech is a natural right that must be protected as crucial to our autonomy and individuality as citizens. And you also argue that some of the greatest threats to free speech today come not from traditional venues, but from online environments. Tell us more about the thesis of your book and why you think that online speech is so much imperiled.
Well, thank you very much for having me in this beautiful facility to talk about such a great subject. The book does start with a sort of threshold question that I suggest that people need to answer. Part of the point of the book was looking at the periods and personalities that have helped shape our view through history of free speech, to try to explain why we're still struggling with it, why we have this sort of slippery slope that we've been on for decades. And one of the things that I suggest is that we've never really resolved what free speech is. That what I argue is that at the beginning of our republic, the most revolutionary part of the American Revolution was a different view of free speech. It was the greatest break from Britain. And it was a view that free speech is a human right, which is very different from what Britain maintained. That was lost early on, and it was lost to a sort of what I call a functionalist view of free speech. And it goes something like this, you've probably heard it today, which is that free speech is protected where it advances democracy, where it has this function of making democracy better. And there is a difference there. Certainly free speech does that and much, much more. But if you believe that free speech is a human right, it moves that center of gravity in terms of these trade-offs that we often make with free speech. And I believe that those trade-offs are often wrong, and that if you believe that free speech is a human right, then it's not just your right to speak in the sense that it's good for democracy, but rather that free speech makes people completely human, that you need to project part of yourself in the world around you through expression. And if that's what you believe, then it changes this dynamic.
Many thanks for that. Kenji, you serve on the Meta Oversight Board, and you've done such important work in helping analyze free speech questions for Meta from a nuanced and distinct perspective that can really teach all of us much about how to analyze free speech questions. In other contexts, we had a great podcast on how you've looked at questions including Holocaust denial. You heard the first panel, which debated the question of whether or not calls for genocide against Jews should or should not be protected. How does the Meta Oversight Board analyze questions like that, and maybe give us some examples of the way that you balance different values?
Yeah, absolutely. So this may be a less familiar tribunal than many are accustomed to. I do teach constitutional law for a living, so I'm usually more focused on the Supreme Court of the United States. but because I serve on Meta's Oversight Board, let me say a few words about that. So this board was created in 2020 to help Meta resolve some of its thornier content moderation issues, with the understanding that, I think as Jonathan has argued eloquently elsewhere, that in many ways these large social media platforms are state-like in structure, and so therefore need their own tribunals and their own sets of standards. So this is a 21-member body that is looking at Meta's content moderation policies and evaluating them against human rights standards, including the human rights standard of expression and voice. However, just to riff a little bit off of what Jonathan said, we could all agree that voice is a human right, and I thought it was beautifully put in the way that you did, Jonathan, to say that the capacity to express ourselves completes us as human beings. But there are other human rights as well, like the right to privacy, or the right to safety, or the right to authenticity, or the right to dignity, that are also rights that are competing, right, with that right of voice. So from Meta's perspective, voice is paramount. So in that sense, it has a very US focused jurisprudence, but it does balance the right of speech against those other values that I just articulated in ways that are more kind of contrarian, I would say, to First Amendment jurisprudence. So I think this is like just listening to the applause in the earlier sessions. It's a very, very pro sort of conventional First Amendment crowd. So let me sort of give you the good news and the bad news from that perspective for the Meta Oversight Board. So the good news is that in many instances, the Oversight Board has tried to say voice is a value no matter whence it comes. So I think some of our most successful cases arise because we can do something that the federal courts here cannot do, which is that we can bundle cases. So we can wait and watch for cases that appear on both sides of the speech spectrum ideologically, bundle them together, and make it almost like a test case for why you should be speech protective across the board, regardless of ideology. So let me give two examples of that. One example is pro and anti-abortion speech cases where we had some posts for and anti-abortion. We bundled them together and we said speech should be protected. All of these posts should be left up because this is a debate that people should be having. What was great about that is that no one could say, as they often do in Supreme Court cases, that whichever side lost on the speech issue, whoever's speech got taken down, would say, my speech rights are being violated and this is just ideological and it's just about whose ox is getting gored. Because we said, look, here are kind of equal and opposed forces. We believe the debate should go on both sides of this. And so we protected speech on both sides. And it was amazing how well received that decision was, because the sort of questions almost answered themselves because you had this balanced set of equally passionate views on both sides. Another even harder case for us where we did really hold our collective breaths was not a formal bundle, but linked cases coming out of the Middle East conflict. So there was a harrowing video that came out of Gaza where a hospital had been bombed, and then an equally harrowing video that came from the Israel side where a woman was pleading with her captors not to kidnap her. And so we linked those two together and we said both of these should be left up. Right, because even though they're quite disturbing, and I would challenge anyone to look at this and not be viscerally moved by it, the value here was in thinking about why those videos were performing a function. So the friends and families of the individuals in the Al-Shifa hospital deserve to know that they were there. In a media desert during the fog of war, right, it's very hard to get that kind of information. Similarly, the family and friends of the woman in Israel deserve to know that she was a captive, and they could look at the circumstances of her capture and perhaps help locate that individual or get the word out about who had captured her. So that's the good news, right? Because in both cases, what we did was to say, here are vehement opinions on both sides, right? Here are visceral, disturbing views on both sides in the Middle East conflict case, but we're going to protect all of them, leave them all up. I think where it gets more complicated from a kind of traditionalist First Amendment perspective are instances where we balance away the speech right and say that another value trumps. So the Holocaust denial case, Jeff, that you mentioned is a very good example of that, where we said, look, Holocaust denial is a form of hate speech, and so we are actually going to protect, right? We're going to force the individual to take down the speech in order to protect the interests of Jewish individuals who are going to be harmed by Holocaust denial. So, my colleagues can correct me or disagree with me, but as I read First Amendment jurisprudence, mere falsity is not enough under the Alvarez case in 2012 to have something be unprotected by speech. But of course, this is not a governmental actor. This is what Marianne Franks was saying on the last panel. So Meta has the capacity to weigh the First Amendment value against other values differently. And in this particular case, we weighed we said that Meta was right in order to take down the Holocaust denial. Another example of this would be a trans flag case where there was a flag that was erected on a post, and it was in Poland. The caption was "Self-hanging curtains, spring cleanings." It's clearly a kind of urging trans people to kill themselves, as we saw it. So it came up under Meta's suicide and self-injury policy and under its hate speech policies as well. And we said that that needed to come down under Meta's hate speech policies that protect individuals based on gender identity. So in those two instances, one about disinformation, one about hate speech, Alvarez on the First Amendment side with regard to misinformation, and then cases like RAV on the hate speech side, or the Collins case, Nazis get to march in Skokie, or you get to burn a cross on your yard, and that's can't be sanctioned by the government. We chose differently from the ways in which the Supreme Court did. And in the pre-call with Nadine, whom I hugely respect, there's a big question that I was happy to get agreement on from her, which is to say, and you can retract this, I'm not holding you to this, but she said, I actually think private actors should have the running room to depart from First Amendment norms because they're not the government. If we actually poke at that and say, why is it that private actors should get more running room in this area, I think it would have to do with things like the sanctions that are being imposed are less, like Meta cannot throw you in jail, right, or cannot sanction you in ways that governments can sanction you. And then alternatively, Meta as a private actor has speech interests of its own. As Paul Clement argued in the Net Choice case before the Supreme Court, this is like, there's no perfect analogy to social media, frankly, but he said the social media platforms are like anthologists who are curating content, right? So it's a lot of content, but there is a curation involved, and that's entitled to its own free speech interests. So to sum up, Meta Oversight Board is a kind of independent tribunal that thinks about these thorny content moderation issues for the 3 billion plus users who are on Meta's platforms. There's some good news for the First Amendment kind of enthusiast, right, with regard to the decisions that we've arrived at, insofar as you look at the Middle East conflict cases or the abortion rights cases, that's very much traditional textbook First Amendment protection. But then in other places, like in the domain of misinformation or in the domain of hate speech, we've departed from US canonical First Amendment doctrine by saying speech is less protected in these contexts than it would be in the US Supreme Court or a governmental actor involved.
Thank you so much for summing up that important work so well. Nadine, I'm so eager for your reaction to Kenji's description of the work and the particular decisions of the Meta Oversight Board. I think you were asked to serve on the board and you chose not to do that. You are, whenever I have a question of what traditional First Amendment doctrine would require, I ask, what would Nadine say? So I can't wait to hear both what you think of the particular balance that Kenji describes the board striking, and also whether you think it's a good idea to have social media companies delegate to brilliant and thoughtful scholars like Kenji and others the ability to strike these balances, or whether you think that broadly traditional First Amendment values should apply.
Okay, excellent series of questions. And first of all, Kenji, of course I defend the free speech and other First Amendment rights, including freedom of association, of private sector actors to make their own decisions about what speech, what speakers to platform, and what not to platform. That is an enactment and promotion of First Amendment values itself. And so I disagree with those state governments that tried to restrict and rein in content moderation policies of these platforms. To me, that is analogous to trying to restrict decisions that are made by newspapers or by television stations or others who are in the business of deciding what speech to air and what not to air. So, and I think it's wonderful. I was very skeptical about the Oversight Board initially, and I've been, as I told Kenji, very pleasantly surprised for this reason. To my mind, the board has been much more supportive of traditional First Amendment values than I had expected. And what's really interesting about that, Jeff, is that the board is appropriately not even adhering to or trying to adhere to First Amendment values, but what it is saying it is adhering to, and every opinion goes through an analysis, are the international human rights free speech values that are in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and a couple other international treaties that have been ratified by virtually every country in the world, including the United States, which made a couple of reservations and exceptions. But there hasn't been much case law under this international human rights free speech regime. And now we are starting to generate a very impressive body of interpretation, which is very speech protective. And some experts on international human rights free speech law, some of whom are serving with Kenji on the Meta Oversight Board, have argued that there is a rationale, if you look at the language and the original intent and all the sources of interpretation of those treaty provisions, that there is a lot of speech protective rationale there. And just as for most of our history, we did not have a very speech protective interpretation of the First Amendment, as Marianne talks about, the failure of the First Amendment to be implemented, to be respected. And that is exactly when crusading reformist voices that were advocating for human rights were repressed, because the First Amendment was not enforced. And we saw an evolution toward more speech protective enforcement. And I think what the Oversight Board is doing, from my perspective, that's very positive, is an evolution toward a speech protective interpretation of the international human rights guarantee, with some exceptions. And Kenji pointed to a couple of cases that came out differently from what they would have under US law. Let me talk about the Holocaust denial situation, a case that is of very urgent concern to me as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I could not be more opposed to Nazism. I could not be more in favor of people understanding what happened under the Holocaust, and with refuting the myths and lies that are perpetrated by Holocaust deniers. I continue to believe, though, that censorship, deplatforming in this situation, is not the effective way to counter myths and lies and denial about the Holocaust. What we are trying to do is to change people's attitudes, to try to persuade people, to try to inform people. And you don't do that through punishment. Social scientists and historians have shown that if people have conspiracy theories, those theories tend to be reinforced by the punishment, not repudiated by the punishment. And I speak from a personal desire to have more information and more, which comes out through the debate, right? As opposed to through suppression. But let me quote the experts. The leading historians of the Holocaust, including Deborah Lipstadt, who serves an official position in the Biden administration. I don't know what the title exactly is, but an ambassador against anti-Semitism. And she has staunchly opposed, as have all the leading historians on the Holocaust, staunchly opposed suppressing Holocaust denial. Not because they want the denial to be accepted, but for exactly the opposite reason. Let the arguments come out there. It gives a chance to come out with the evidence and to refute it. So I completely agree with Kenji, and I think Marianne and the former panel were making the points very strongly that important as freedom of speech is under American law and under international law, it certainly is not the only human rights value. I mean, I was national president of the ACLU, which defended all fundamental freedoms for all people, not only First Amendment freedoms, but based on that experience, based on my study of history and experience in this country and around the world, I remain convinced that the most effective way to advance all the other human rights and to counter all of the hatred and all of the discrimination and the genocide and the Holocaust is through more free speech. What is it that finally brought about abolition of slavery? What is it that finally brought about civil rights in this country? It is the exercise of free speech. And so I keep saying that I continue to believe this because I tried very hard to be open-minded. If I saw evidence that suppression of Holocaust denial would actually be effective in countering anti-Semitism, I would be open-minded to that. And more importantly, the United States Supreme Court would, because the Supreme Court rightly has not said free speech is absolute. A restriction on free speech can be justified if it is shown to be necessary to advance a countervailing, compelling goal, which certainly suppressing anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination are.
Many thanks for that. Jonathan, there's so much in your important book about online speech, and you discuss the Twitter files where Jack Dorsey, the previous head of Twitter, suppressed election-related speech. Tell us about your analysis of Twitter's performance with the Twitter files, as well as the performance of Elon Musk, who is now being accused of suppressing his critics, and broadly how you think that under your framework we should think about a platform like Twitter. How's it doing, and how could it better protect free speech?
Oh, that's a great question. I have to admit, as a threshold matter, that I'm less supportive of the record at Facebook and Meta on free speech, and I don't view myself as a free speech enthusiast. I think that there's something more to free speech than being an enthusiast. But the role of social media has created a new sort of paradigm for free speech. It's new in the sense that there's a new technology. Free speech has always had this struggle with new technology. The Supreme Court has always fallen behind on technology. You sort of saw that in the Morey and Moody cases where the justices were really flailing about on how to deal with social media. The Twitter files were a game changer. You know, I testified in Congress repeatedly before the Twitter files, and members of Congress repeatedly confronted me and said, you know, Professor, you don't have any proof that there's any coordination between the government and Twitter and Facebook. It's all speculation. And I would say, by the way, we actually do have proof. It's in my testimony. But if you're asking whether we have the internal files of Facebook and Twitter, the answer is no, because they won't turn it over while insisting that they believe in transparency. And then Musk bought Twitter. And he bought Twitter promising to take down the censorship system at Twitter, which he did. That doesn't mean that he hasn't engaged in controversial acts since then, and I certainly wouldn't support that. But when he released the Twitter files, I testified almost immediately after that. And some of the same members that had just told me there's no evidence of coordination turned on a dime and said, well, of course we're censoring. We have to censor. The government has a role here because these are dangerous voices and they're threatening other rights. And one of them, Representative Goldman, said, Professor, what you don't seem to willing to accept is that we're allowed to censor because the internet's a crowded theater and people are crying fire. And I said, you know, Congressman, I don't know if it occurs to you, but that line of Holmes that you're citing is coming out of the Schenck opinion. And it was used to send a socialist to jail for protesting the draft by passing out a flyer that cited the United States Constitution. That's the line you're citing. That's the case you're relying on. And by the way, Holmes moved away from that, and certainly the Supreme Court moved away from Schenck. Is that the standard you want? Is that what's going to guide us into this future with this new technology? And he immediately cut me off and said, you know, Professor, we don't need a law lecture. And I said, I think you do. I mean, the thing is, I think you do because you're the same voice. These are the same voices we've heard since the beginning of the Republic. Every generation believes that they have some existential threat that allows them to silence their neighbors. They're the same voices. And they're making the same arguments. In fact, my book talks about they're using some of the same terms that were used at the beginning of the Republic. Because free speech is something that's easier to behold at a distance. It's easier to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe what happened in the McCarthy period. People were censored and blacklisted. And you say, well, how about the censorship and blacklisting going on now? And, oh, no. Well, we didn't have disinformation. Well, you know, it doesn't just, it's not a magic term that you can just say disinformation and wave it. The fact is, this is the most dangerous anti-free speech period in our history because we've never seen an alliance with the government, media, academia, corporations like this one. And that's where I'm not very supportive of Facebook, now Meta. You know, for a while, Facebook was running a commercial trying to get people to embrace what they call content moderation, which is an unbelievably Orwellian term for censorship. And it actually was directing at young people. They had all these young millennials. It was incredibly creepy. And it was trying to get young millennials, because they viewed that as the soft spot, to try to get them to accept content moderation. And this went on, this commercial campaign went on for a while. But the point is, it's all the same thing. Even though the technology is new, it takes a lot to get a free people to give up freedom. And it's really harder than you think. They have to be really afraid, or they have to be really angry. And what happens is that rage rhetoric, which has existed in our country since the beginning, and my book talks about that, becomes state rage. That is, rage rhetoric becomes an excuse for every government to crack down. And the question is whether each generation is willing to give up that part of their freedom. So when I talk about Twitter and Meta, I think that they have been gross in how they have restricted free speech. I just gave a speech at the University of Chicago not long ago. And in the front hall was a bunch of scientists that had been fired and censored and blocked on social media. Many of them were vindicated. Some of them are the leading scientists in their field. And after I spoke to them, I said, how many of you have actually been reinstated? These are people who now the CDC is supporting the things that they wrote about and led to their being suspended. And not one of them, they've all been put back on Twitter, but they're not on their faculties and associations anymore. That's why this is a dangerous anti-free speech period. And so no, I don't believe in those trade-offs because I've heard them before.
Let's just go in order. Kenji, of course, any response that you're moved to make, and then broadly...
Or you can just agree. That is an option.
And then I think you are convinced that the Meta model of an independent board of experts is an effective one for social media. Tell us why. What are the characteristics or institutional arrangements that you think is necessary to make it a success? And do you believe it could scale to other platforms and other venues as well?
Yeah, I do want to respond to my esteemed colleagues before I move to your question, if I may, Jeff. So, I mean, first, to Nadine, I think that the Holocaust denial case, because I'll get in trouble with my fellow board members if I let this lie, we did that as a hate speech case, not as a misinformation case. So in some ways, it's probably not the most apposite. I realize this is my fault because I answered Jeff's question with this, but it's probably not the most apposite thing for us to join issue with on disinformation. I would say, I mean, we could take it up as a hypothetical, but that's not what that case was about. I think when I think about disinformation and where we've done things that are countercultural, I think about the altered video of President Biden case, where we saw President Biden touching his granddaughter because he was pinning a "I voted" sticker to her. And this was manipulated in such a way where it was slowed down and it was put on loop and it made it look like he was touching her inappropriately. So that's misinformation, right? And we said that this should be taken down, right? And in fact, we criticized Meta for having a misinformation policy that was not capacious enough to take that down. And I hear the idea that whenever we say this is misinformation or disinformation, so let's take it down, the response of saying, no, 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 the response to misinformation under canonical First Amendment ideas is more speech. It's not to censor speech, it's to censure speech, right? And so we should always err on the side of more speech. So I understand that argument. I think, Nadine, you said if there's new data or new studies, like I have an open mind. So the new study, one of them that I would want to offer to you is the MIT study that says social media is just different, right? Because if you tell a lie on social media, that will actually propagate much more swiftly than true speech. So this old John Stuart Mill and On Liberty idea of if truth grapples with error on a fair field of debate, then truth will always prevail. I cut my teeth on that. I grew up on that. I believed in it. Hook, line, and sinker. I was a devout believer in that and in the marketplace of ideas. When we get to the social media landscape, that predicate, at least we have to question whether it holds true anymore.
Oh, yeah.
Because a falsehood makes its way around the world before the truth can get its boots on, times 3 billion users, right? So in that landscape, I think we have to really think about this marketplace of ideas to say, yes, the marketplace of ideas is wonderful if it's working, but there are occasionally market failures with regard to disinformation. Yeah. So unless there's a different, view, right, that you would have with regard to the Biden speech, I don't know if you would say we were wrong to take that down or not, right? Because it's election misinformation, and there might be other ways in which you could actually shoehorn it within the U.S. First Amendment jurisprudence. But I can't really see a way of doing that, but we nonetheless took it down, and I stand by that decision.
Well, I have been following the studies that have been done on social media disinformation and what is the most effective way to counter it. And there are a lot of studies, an increasing number of studies, that are negating the conventional wisdom. And one I want to mention because one of the social scientists who worked on it was from the University of Pennsylvania. But these are all international studies that have been reported in the last year or so, which show that the most effective way to counter disinformation online is through using artificial intelligence. And they're using terms like the debunk bot. There was recently a very exciting study that came out at the beginning of September that showed that the power of artificial intelligence, of course, is not only to make disinformation more credible, but also the rebuttal to disinformation more effective. In particular, people who believe conspiracy theories or other false narratives do so for very different reasons, and this so-called debunk bot was able to figure out for each user who subscribed to a false narrative, what it was that made that particular person adopt that belief, and at scale was able to dissuade those people for reasons that were peculiar to them. The New York Times did a big story about this, and it quoted social scientists who were not part of the study, who said, you know, this is really impressive because not only is it effectively rebutting the particular conspiracy theory, but it's also making people more negative toward conspiracy theories in general, and that the effects are much more long-lasting. Now, if I could say something about Jonathan's point, I think it's really important to distinguish content moderation decisions that are made by the companies themselves. They may make very bad decisions, and I've been highly critical of many of their decisions, Jonathan, but just the way I defend freedom for speech that I dislike, I defend freedom for content moderation / editorial decisions that I don't like. I think that's less bad than having the government take over, and that brings me to the really great testimony that you've engaged in so often, Jonathan, and that is pointing out that what is portrayed as voluntary content moderation by the companies, in fact, looks a lot like what you call censorship by proxy, where the government is putting so much power, so much pressure on these companies, either through covert threats, sometimes not so covert threats. You better take down this information or disinformation that we dislike because it's inconsistent with our policy. That is government getting to censor through the back door, and that is no more palatable than government doing it through the front door.
Great.
Thank you so much for that, for this superb discussion. We're almost out of time. I think it's time for closing statements, and I'll allow each of you to bring it home as you think best, but I'll ask a version of the obvious question. Jonathan, why and how is it important to protect free speech?
Well, I think that this is part of what I try to talk about in the Indispensable Right, that is, we can't answer that question unless we can at least reach for each of us what we believe free speech is. If you believe it's a human right, it's different than if you believe this is something that has a function for democracy. Those are two very different models for free speech. Obviously, the model I suggest, which is the human rights model, allows for fewer trade-offs. And I am unapologetic about that. The fact is, and this is sort of amplifies what Nadine said, one of the things I asked in the book is, point to a single censorship system that's ever worked in history. I asked that to an audience once of German academics and judges. And I said, how's it going for you? Right? You've one of the oldest censorship systems in Europe. You've got a robust system. You arrested a guy who simply had a ringtone of Hitler on his phone on a train. Okay? So how's it working for you? Because I watch the news and there's tens of thousands of skinheads and neo-Nazis walking through your towns. Their numbers have never been greater. But a recent poll showed that of German citizens, only 17% of them feel comfortable speaking their views in public. So you've silenced the wrong people. But the question is, maybe it is successful, because that's what censorship, and I'm sorry, content moderation is censorship. That's what it achieves. Now, when it comes to social media companies, obviously the First Amendment applies to the government. It doesn't apply when you're an agent of the government. Okay? But even putting that aside, the mere fact that you might not be directly controlled by the First Amendment doesn't mean that you're not anti-free speech. If there was no constitution or statutory rule against racial discrimination, you would still be a discriminator if you kept out people based on their race or their religion. So don't pretend that the First Amendment is the exclusive definition of free speech. In my view, Meta is an anti-free speech company, so is Twitter. And I think that the history has shown that. But what I would suggest to you is this, that this is not our first age of rage. What people don't like to admit is that they like the rage. They like it because it's addictive and it's contagious. But they don't want to admit that. But it doesn't matter. This country was born in rage. The Boston Tea Party was an act of rage. But it's not rage that defines us as a people. It's free speech.
Kenji, why and how is it important to protect free speech?
Yeah, so I'll begin with a really narrow answer, which is that it's really important not to conflate the Oversight Board with Meta itself, because oftentimes the board intervenes in ways that forces Meta to protect free speech more. So if you think about the very moving conversation with which we began this evening, one of our cases was a death to Khomeini case, that originally was, it's questioned whether that should be taken down, and the government certainly wanted it to be taken down. And the Oversight Board ruled that it had to stay up because it wasn't a credible threat to Khomeini. It was, a protest movement slogan that was critically important for political speech. So that's thought number one. Thought number two is I do sort of get really puzzled when there's a conflation between content moderation and censorship, because I wonder how anyone would feel if they logged on to one of these social media platforms and they got completely unmoderated content. You would just get a chronological feed that would make no sense to you whatsoever. So if there needs to be some curation for that to even be intelligible to a human being, if you don't want pornography on your teenage daughter's platform or the like, you're engaged in content moderation. So to call all of that censorship seems to be painting with too broad a brush, something that we reserve to have a very pejorative content. Like censorship is inherently pejorative, right, in my view, whereas content moderation is something that's inevitable. So if you're calling the thing that's inevitable content moderation, right, all of it censorship, then I think we have a problem, because there's obviously bad and good forms of content moderation. I would stand second to no one in saying that I believe that if you engaged in viewpoint discrimination on political grounds and content moderated on that basis, that would be an enormous problem. The Oversight Board would be on that in a hot second, because there's no justification for that kind of moderation. But if you're saying, no, you don't get to actually have these really grisly images of, exposed organs, right, to horrify people, and we're going to moderate that out. Or if we have a dangerous organizations and individuals policy that says, no, you don't get to praise, Hamas, right, on the website, then, I think we have more of a square debate. So I think what I'm trying to say is, unless, in the end, I'm here because I deeply care about free expression, I just think that we have to think really carefully and deeply, right, in a vastly different social landscape. So one of my colleagues in the profession, our colleague in the profession, Tim Wu, says, is the First Amendment obsolete? So reporting, not endorsing, and not endorsing, right, the idea that the First Amendment would be obsolete. But he says we're in a totally different landscape with social media, because it used to be the First Amendment model that we developed in the early 1900s was this model of it was very, very hard to speak, right? And government was a primary censor. So you needed access to a newspaper, or you needed access to a publisher in order to publish your thoughts. And there are lots of gates along the way, as there still are for traditional media. And then the primary censor that was shutting that down was government. Right? Today, it's a really different landscape, right? Anyone with a social media account can be a publisher of their own speech, and that's a really wonderful thing from the perspective of expression. But we also need a different model that says the only threat to speech, or the primary threat, is not necessarily government. I think this is out of your playbook, Jonathan. It's also these social media companies and these private actors that are shutting down expression. So my brief today is not to say, oh, let's get rid of the First Amendment, or let's kind of bargain away, First Amendment values of speech. It's to say, if we are really going to be true to our First Amendment commitments, we have to update those commitments and understand them in a landscape that is completely different from the genesis of those First Amendment commitments in the early 1900s. That the nature of technology, the fact that these posts are both infinite and infinitesimal, so any one of them might seem completely innocent, but in the aggregate, if you have a tsunami of eating disorder prompts that are hitting your teenage daughter, as someone who has a teenage daughter, I can testify to this, it might feel really different, right, to look at that kind of abuse on that scale. So it's those kinds of considerations that I just want to put forward to you, not because I'm opposed to speech, but I think that if free speech is going to survive, we're going to have to look at these new challenges squarely in the face.
Nadine, last word in this great discussion. To you, why and how should we protect free speech?
Jeff, nobody can say it better than our mutual hero, Justice Louis Brandeis, or you quoting him from memory, that freedom of speech, which, by the way, has been advocated and activated for by human beings all around the world throughout history. People have died for this right. There seems to be an inherent human desire for self-expression, for self-exploration. That's what Brandeis talked about as the intrinsic value of free speech that seems to be universal among us human beings. There is also, as Brandeis said, the instrumental value of free speech. It is by far the most potent, demonstrably effective weapon, not always effective, not immediately effective, but it is what every single movement for human rights and social progress and equality and every other good thing has depended on freedom of speech. I could quote so many leaders of towering human rights movements and struggles. We're out of time, so I'll end with just one, which I'm sure many of you have heard, and it's representative of spokespeople for many human rights causes. But I'm quoting the great civil rights leader, longtime Congressman John Lewis, who said, without freedom of speech, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. Without freedom of speech, every human rights cause would be a bird without wings.
Beautiful. Friends, I'm so grateful to you for taking the time this evening to listen to this thoughtful, deep, vigorous discussion with agreement and disagreement about the meaning of the First Amendment. What we've learned from the brilliant scholars that we've assembled is, as Justice Holmes said, that the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view. And the point of this discussion of how and why to protect free speech is not agreement, but the thoughtful exchange of ideas so that we ultimately more deeply understand the basic value, the central value, the foundational value that is shimmering on the wall behind you. There's so many quotations to end with. I often love Brandeis, and Nadine, I'm so glad you called him out. But I'm moved to recall the inspiring words of Justice Robert Jackson, who said, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, shall prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of speech, politics, nationality, or religion, or compel the forced allegiance thereof. Beautiful words. Thank you so much for joining our symposium.